Now that you've finished all your blocks, in this video we're going to put the cushion together.
This is the second video for the Heart of Fold cushion. In this video we show you the process and techniques we use to construct our cushion. Let's begin by working out your desired layout. For our cushion we chose to do 3 blocks by 3 blocks. It is up to you how you lay out your blocks and how many you use. Once you have figured out your layout, place the first 2 blocks from the first row right sides together. Match up one of the side edges and then pin together. Take your 2 joined blocks over to your sewing machine. You will see that on the back of the blocks there will be 2 lines around the perimeter of the blocks. These lines are created from the stitch down of batting 1 and fabric A. Stitch directly in between these 2 lines. It will be about 1/2 inch. Once stitched together, take these 2 blocks back over to your work surface and open out. Repeat this same pinning and stitching process until you have completed that first row. You can then continue joining the blocks together in the remaining rows. Using your iron, press the seams open from the back. You can also give the front of the blocks a good press as well. Return to your work surface to begin joining the rows together. Place the first 2 rows right sides together and pin along that long edge. Using your sewing machine, stitch the 2 rows together, again stitching in between those 2 lines on the back of the blocks. When we stitch blocks together, we pin at one end and match the blocks up as we are stitching. However, you can do whatever works best for you. Once stitched together, take these 2 rows back over to your work surface and open out. Repeat this same pinning and stitching process until you have joined all of the rows together. Use your iron to press the seams on the back of the blocks open. Also, give the front of the blocks a good press too. We are now up to making the borders for the cushion. Now this is completely optional, you can choose not to do the borders or you can add borders. We chose to add them to our cushion and actually chose to do the mitered corners. Firstly, cut all of the required lengths of fabric. You will find all fabric requirements and methods in the instructions provided. Place the inside border and middle border right sides together. These are fabric C and fabric D. Match up one of the longer edges and then pin together. Instead of using pins, I used quilting clips. I sometimes just prefer these over normal pins. Take the 2 strips over to the sewing machine and stitch together using a 1/4 inch seam. Use your iron to press the seam open. Using the same pinning and stitching method, join the outer border, which is fabric E, to the opposite edge of the middle border. Now that we have the inside, middle and outer border strips all joined together, we need to add the batting to the underside. To secure the batting to the back of the fabric, you can either use a temporary spray adhesive or you can stitch along the two long edges with a basting stitch. We use the adhesive spray. Repeat the above process that we just went through for the remaining 3 borders. We now need to find the middle of the cushion front. With your cushion front right side up on your work surface, fold it in half, right sides together. Once folded, mark the fold with a pin on both edges. You can then unfold and put aside. Do the same thing with one of the borders. Fold one of the borders right sides together and short ends together. Pin the fold on the inside border edge, and once you have made the mark, you can unfold. Lay your border right side facing up. Place your cushion front on top of the border right sides together. Match up the middle mark on one of the edges of the cushion front with the middle mark on the border. Pin the two together along this edge. Using your sewing machine, sew the two together. Begin in one corner and then end in the opposite corner. This is called sewing to the net, where you do not sew into the seams. Please see the instructions for photos and more detail on how to do this. Now that we have our first border attached to one side of the cushion front, we suggest removing the excess batting from the seam. If you used a basting stitch on your borders, you will then have stitching the whole length of the border. If you used spray adhesive, like we did, you will not have stitching the whole length. Use a pen and ruler to make your cutting mark. Once this is done, use your applique scissors to trim away the excess batting. Fold your border over and give it a good press with the iron. Repeat the above steps to attach the opposite side border. Before we attach the end borders, we suggest lifting up the excess fabric from the side borders and pinning them out of the way. Find your middle marks again by folding the cushion front and borders in half and pinning the fold. Repeat the pinning and stitching process to attach the end borders, as well as the trimming of the batting in the seams. Make sure you are stitching to the net and not stitching into the seams. Once all of the borders have been attached, unpin the excess fabric from the side borders and give a good press with the iron. We are now up to creating the mitered corners. Begin by folding one side border on top of one end border, right sides together. When matching up the two borders together, make sure the two ends are meeting, as well as all of the joins in the borders are directly on top of each other. This little flap from the seams of the blocks that I am pointing to, lift it up and pin it out of the way. We don't want to sew this part down. Line up a ruler with the fold and use a pen to make a mark across the borders that is directly in line with the fold. If you are using a striped fabric or similar, we suggest pinning across the line as well. Use your sewing machine to stitch directly over this mark. Remove the pins and unfold. The joins in the border should all meet up with each other. If not, repeat the above steps until you have achieved a nice mitered corner. Using your applique scissors, trim out any of the excess batting from the ends of the joined borders. Also trim the excess fabric back to 1/4 of an inch. Take your cushion front over to the ironing board and use the iron to press the seam open on the back. Trim any of the excess seam that you can see from the front. Repeat the above process to create the mitered corners in the remaining 3 corners of the cushion. Trim back the borders if you find necessary. Top stitch the inside border. This will give the borders a neat flat finish. Make sure you use a colour thread that matches the colour of the inside border fabric. Well done, you have now finished the full front of the cushion. Our next steps are to create the back of the cushion. Now this part is completely up to you. You can make it like a big mug rug and turn it out through a side seam. You can make an envelope-like backing. You can add buttons as a closure to your backing, or like we have done, add a zipper as a closure for the backing. Please see the instructions on how to work out the measurements for the backing fabric. Once you have your cut piece of fabric, fold it in half widthways. Use your iron to give the fold a good press. Once you have done this, unfold your fabric. Cut along this crease. You will then be left with 2 pieces of fabric. Place these 2 pieces of fabric on top of each other and right sides together. Match the 2 up along the cut edge. Pin together. Use a measuring tape to find the middle of that cut edge. Mark with a pin or pen. Fold the zipper in half to find the middle. Match the middle of the zipper up with the middle mark on the fabric. Use a pen and mark where the stoppers of the zipper are on the fabric. Remove the zipper and then pin where you have made the 2 marks. Move your fabric over to the sewing machine. Using a 1-inch seam, start sewing at one end and use a stitch length of 2.5. Stop stitching when you get to the first stopper mark. Make sure you keep your needle down and back stitch a couple of stitches. Continue stitching from the first stopper mark using a stitch length of 5.0 or the longest stitch your machine can do, and stop when you get to the second stopper mark. Make sure you keep your needle down and back stitch a couple of stitches. Continue stitching from this second stopper mark using a stitch length of 2.5 and stitch all the way to the end of the fabric. Now take your joint pieces of fabric over to the ironing board and iron that seam open. Grab your zipper and lay it wrong side up directly over the top of the seam. Match the zipper stoppers up with their marks and tape in place. Flip the fabric over very carefully so the right side is now facing up. We are now going to use pins to secure the zipper even more in place. Use your fingers and feel where the zipper teeth are. Make sure they are directly in line with the seam. Using as many pins as you feel necessary, pin the zipper in place. Flip the fabric over and remove the tape from the back. Take the backing fabric over to the sewing machine as we are now going to be stitching the zipper in place. Make sure your top thread matches the colour of your fabric. Start stitching at the end of the zipper that doesn't have the zipper pull. When you stitch across this end, make sure you are stitching on the inside of the zipper stopper. Pivot the fabric and continue stitching along the side of the zipper, removing pins as you go. When stitching along the sides, make sure you line the edge of the machine foot up with the edge of the zipper teeth. When the machine foot comes close to the zipper pull, you will need to pause the machine and unzip the zipper a little bit to get the zipper pull out of the way. This part can get quite tricky, but just remember to take your time. You can also see our instructions for a diagram and more detail on how to attach the zipper. Now make your way around the zipper pull, maneuvering the zipper pull as you go. Then continue stitching along the opposite side of the zipper and stopping your stitching where you first started. Now that we have attached our zipper, take your backing fabric over to your work table. Using an unpicker or quick unpick, remove the stitches in the seam that are directly over the top of the zipper teeth. These are the stitches that were 5.0 in length. The remaining smaller stitches in the seams will not come undone because of the back stitching we did earlier. We are now up to attaching the lining. Fold your backing fabric in half, wrong sides together, and put aside. Grab one piece of your cut lining fabric, this will be fabric L, and place it right side up on your work table. Place your folded backing fabric directly over the top. Line up a long edge of fabric L with one side of the seam in the backing fabric and pin or clip in place. Take the two pieces of fabric over to the sewing machine and begin stitching the two together. Use a generous 1/2 inch seam and make sure your stitching is catching the sides of the zipper. Repeat the above process to attach the second piece of fabric L to the other side of the zipper seam. Now that you have attached both pieces of fabric L to the backing, lay it all flat on your work table. Have one piece of fabric L under one half of the backing and then the second fabric L piece under the second half of the backing. Make sure the backing fabric is facing right sides up. Place the cushion front wrong side up on top of the backing fabric and make sure the open zipper is lining up with the middle of the cushion front. Use pins to secure in place. Move over to your sewing machine and stitch the two together using a 1/4 inch seam. Stitch right around the perimeter of the cushion and stop stitching where you started. Take the cushion back to your work table and trim away the excess fabric from fabric M so it is then the same size as the rest of the cushion, but just make sure you leave about an inch of excess fabric at the opening. We are now up to attaching our final piece of fabric. This will be fabric M. Lay your fabric M right side up on top of your work table and place your cushion directly on top. Make sure the wrong side of the cushion front is facing up. Pin around the perimeter of the cushion. This time, however, we will need to leave a gap in the middle of one of the edges. Make this gap about 8 inches wide. Again, with your sewing machine, stitch a 1/2 inch seam around the cushion. Start stitching at one end of the gap and then finish stitching at the other end of the gap. With a pair of sharp scissors, trim back the corners. Be very careful not to cut into any stitching. To get the cushion facing right sides out, turn through the opening that you left in one of the edges. Take your time and be careful not to rip any seams. Once you have turned it out, we suggest using a pointy implement to help push out the corners. To close the gap, you can either use fabric glue or a needle and thread. Our final step is to turn the cushion out once more, this time through the open zipper. Take your time and again use a pointy implement to push out the corners. Well done! You have now finished your How to Fold cushion. Thank you for participating in this month's Sew Along. We can't wait to see what everybody creates.